The Quiet's new Pure Base 600 chassis fills a stout form factor using a structure that shrinks as much as possible while still supporting standard orientation ATX motherboards. This new $90 case focuses primarily on sound damping and quality materials, but misses a few points on cable management and thermal design. We'll talk through that in today's review of the new Be Quiet Pure Base 600 case. The most standout feature with this case, or maybe lack of a feature, is there are no RGB LEDs, and also no tempered glass. Now, technically, Be Quiet is planning a tempered glass version that will come out in March, and it'll be $10 more, but we are going to pretend that won't exist for now because, honestly, it's been tempered glass cases nonstop for 8 months, and I'm just gonna cherish this non-tempered glass option for a moment. So this is a more standard case. It's back to the roots of a case, what a mid-tower would be. It's very simple. There's a steel structure, there are plastic panels, and then it has one feature, which in this case is noise damping. Aiding that noise damping, as you'll see in B-roll of the front panel, I'm sure, is the fact that this has very restrictive airflow, which, although not great for thermals, obviously, is good for noise emissions and controlling them. So we'll test the noise output and the cooling performance in today's review, looking at the GPU and CPU performance when under workloads that are a bit more stressful than normally. Cooling isn't a primary focus with this case, clearly, as you won't be getting much air through that front panel that we pointed out, and no air can exhaust out the top without adjusting the height of the panel. That said, the Be Quiet Pure Base 600 uniquely intends for its top panel to be user configurable to fit specific needs. In its stock configuration, the panel is pushed down and completely blocks top exhaust, consequently blocking noise and keeping it in for the most part. You can pop the top panel completely out, which does eliminate the purpose of the case, or you can follow Be Quiet's guide and elevate it by 1 notch in the little clips that exist on the underside of the panel. This grants some breathability while still offering control over sound waves escaping the box. As for stock cooling, Be Quiet ships the Pure Base 600 with 2 PureWinds 2 fans pre-installed in front and rear positions. The front-mounted fan is oriented by default to split airflow between the video card and CPU coolers, maxing out its RPM around 1200. And again, there's limited airflow capabilities behind all these filters. So for filters, you can pull the front panel off, and there's a sort of mesh that's interlocked with another mesh, which is purely a dust/noise thing, but really tight in the front for air intake. The bottom is reserved entirely for the power supply because it's a down-facing fan for the power supply. Very little height here from the table or the surface of whatever you put it on to the case. It's about 1 inch or so, which is okay, but because we're only pulling air in through the power supply anyway, that's kind of irrelevant. The power supply doesn't need that much space to breathe. It's not like we have a case fan down there. There's a rear exhaust position for a 120, pretty standard. Technically, you could mount stuff in the top of the case, but including radiators, but you would really have to take off that top panel to get any reasonable use out of it. Now you could offset it by 1 notch up, but as we'll see in our thermal test, it doesn't really change a whole lot in terms of cooling performance. It would be enough to force the air out of the case if you had an exhaust setup, but it's really just a noise thing. So that's what we've got for cooling options, not a whole lot. Noise options, there is foam padding on that side panel, the left side panel, and the front panel has it's closed off, so no noise is getting out of there anyway. With regard to build features, the hard drive cages are interesting and remind us in some ways of an internal version of Thermaltake's old Level 10 case, designed by BMW at the time. The cages in Be Quiet's Pure Base 600 mount to the chassis by 3 screws only, suspending HDDs from one side, that'd be the chassis mounting wall. And these can be removed individually if not all are saturated. Also kind of unique because you don't have to remove entire cages. And above those, there are 2 non-modular fixed 5¼ inch bays for optical drive installation, or front panels, which is a rarity in today's case market. With regard to ease of installation, building in this case is similar to building in an NZXT S340 Elite, or S340 for that matter, or the Corsair 400C. They're all roughly the same size. Some are easier to build in than others, like the S340 Elite, which we praised for its excellent cable management. This does not have that. The ATX form factor support means that if you do in fact install an ATX form factor motherboard, the bottom of the board is going to be right against the power supply, eliminating usage of some of the cable pass-throughs, and then the right side of the board will be covering, or partially or entirely, some of the pass-throughs in the middle of the motherboard tray. So that's a big issue with the Pure Base 600. Because of the way the case is configured, again, the primary pass-throughs for cabling end up being in the drive cage area, although there's one pass-through that's usable near the optical drive bays and the 24-pin power header. Fortunately, Be Quiet did also get its EPS 12-volt pass-through placement correct, accommodating the left side and centered placement alike. This is particularly good for motherboard users with additional power headers for overclocking, although that seems unlikely given the price of this case. If you're planning to use ATX in the case, be aware again that it'll feel like the entire thing should be about an inch longer and maybe half an inch taller to better route the cables. The upshot of Be Quiet's design is that the backside does have the usual cable tie anchors, so once you've got things managed and routed, it's not too difficult to tie them down. That said, the SSD cages are pretty tight against that side panel wall and its foam, so do be careful that you don't snap the SSD headers once you've got it connected. All parts of the case, both the steel and the plastic components, are fairly rugged and durable. There's an exception of the plastic top cover, which isn't stable on our review sample when it's at its full height, and everything fit together pretty well. There were no unintentional gaps between the side panel and the case. That's a good thing considering it's noise focused, and all the paneling lined up for a flush fit, unlike some of the cheaper cases on the market. Be Quiet has impressed us in the past with the quality of their materials and machining, as we've seen previously with the silent base cases and the dark base case, and the 600 is no exception despite its price. The top cover can either be pressed flush to the case or lifted 1 or 2 notches above it for airflow, but its stability at maximum height depends on whether all the plastic tabs are at the same angle. Not a huge deal, since snapping the cover down 1 notch locked it in firmly, but both side panels must be removed in order to adjust this cover. Kind of a pain, and it can't be done on the fly. You probably want to shut down to do that every time. This isn't like the old Roswell throne, where you can flip a switch and latch them up or down. We were particularly pleased to see that the front I/O connectors and buttons are mounted directly to the chassis and the frame rather than the front panel, so you don't have to deal with wires and untangling them when removing the paneling. There's also less of a chance of pushing connectors out of place, of course. Speaking of front I/O, it only includes 2 USB 3.0 plugs and no 2.0 at all. So if you're running some older AM3 platform with no USB 3 support, then maybe don't get this case or get an adapter. This is possibly necessary given the size of the panel, but I guess it's more of a move forward and Be Quiet trying to get away from USB 2.0. Getting into the thermal and noise testing, as always, if you're curious how we do this, hit the link in the description below for the testing methodology and Patrick Lathan's full review. He ran the tests and worked with the case the most. So we've got all that defined there. The very basics, we're using delta T numbers for temperatures, which means that we have a thermocouple reader that's actively monitoring the internal ambient of the case, which is really only used for an ambient chart, and that probe is placed sort of triangulated between the front intake fan, the CPU fan, and the GPU fan. It sits right there in the middle of them. And in some cases, that makes temperatures look really bad, like the Inwin case, where there's no front intake, the 805 Infinity. But that's where one of them goes. The other one monitors the environment temperature, the room temperature, more or less, and that's what we use for our delta T value, which, again, you can read about in the description below. And so something had to be sacrificed for silence on a budget. The number one thing on that list was airflow. Front intake is through 2 filtered slits on either side of the panel, and that's it. Bottom intake is reserved for the PSU, as discussed. The cover is impractical to adjust at the top when the system is running, and so users are forced to make a decision between silence and cooling, and presumably you would choose silence since you're buying a case from a company called Be Quiet! Testing with the top panel open versus closed, and with the same fan RPM between each test, we're seeing a difference of about 1.6 Celsius load, or about 4 to 5 Celsius idle. Considering we're brushing against 90°C territory when factoring ambient back in, it's clear we're going to need more than better top ventilation to improve thermals with our test configuration. Stock, the PureBase 600 outperforms Inwin's fanless 303 case and a single fan 805 Infinity, which is really not a particularly ringing endorsement. You could completely remove the top cover, but you'd still be limited at the intake level, and you'd then be exiting the only use case for this chassis, which is reduced noise. Just a reminder, our temperature testing for cases puts it under a worst case scenario. So we're looking at 100% GPU and CPU load. That's not common or really active in any type of gaming for the most part, but the test is designed to stack cases hierarchically based on their cooling performance only, and that's all we need to know. So what we learned from that, this case is worse than the others at cooling. That's what we want to know. Now, in terms of real world scenarios, you probably won't be as hot as we're seeing here, unless doing some sort of 24/7 rendering or long render workloads where you might have the GPU and the CPU crunching on frames from two different directions. You wouldn't want to do that in this type of case. And then overclocking, anything where you're pushing a CPU to 150, 170 watts and beyond is definitely going to be a bit toasty in here. You might want to look elsewhere for an enclosure. This is not something you would buy for cooling performance. You maybe would look to Corsair's 400C for that, similarly priced, much better at cooling, but not this. Now, in terms of the use cases, that's all going to be in noise, which we'll get into next. And then just a quick side note here, because it is a $90 case, it's more likely that purchasers would probably be on something like a 1060, maybe 1070 Max, and those are going to be a bit cooler than some of the high-end cards that would be more overclock focused. And so let's take a look at noise. This is where Be Quiet undoubtedly specializes. The PureBass 600 really comes into its own in acoustic tests in ideal conditions with fans turned all the way down, which you probably wouldn't really want to run like that too often other than idle. And with the top cover closed, the 600 is the quietest case we've used in our current batch of tests. This is impressive, if only because it's quieter than the stock Inwin 303, which does not have any fans included at all, and that's entirely thanks to the sound damping panel design of the Be Quiet case, which is containing the noise of our GPU fan and our CPU fan. With both the 120mm fans at the maximum 1160 RPM and with the top cover open, at least by one notch, noise peaked at 34.2 dBA, making it slightly quieter than the NZXT S340 Elite with its two 120mm fans running at 1050 RPM. We may do some future testing on how much Be Quiet's acoustic padding directly affects noise in A/B testing, but for now it seems like it's really doing the job it's advertised to perform. Be Quiet's done well to design a case that excels in one category, being quiet. Compared to nearby competition, it's clearly better in the acoustics department. If that's the thing you care about, this is a good place to start looking. It is both visually and aurally discreet. The outside really doesn't look like much of anything. It looks kind of like an old Dell computer you might buy and stuff in a corner somewhere. So that's a valid thing to want. If you want that, there you go. I guess it's there. In this way, it is sort of similar to some of the fractal design cases, which are often noise focused and discretion focused in terms of visuals. So this would be in the similar price category for some of the fractal cases. You may want to look there for options alternative to this. In terms of cooling, again, if cooling is going to be a problem for your build, don't buy this, because if you are planning to run multi-GPU, instantly you're going to run into problems with temperatures and with clock rates being more limited thermally than by anything else, almost certainly. And then if you're looking at running things like higher temperature M.2 SSDs under steady state workloads, pretty uncommon for our user base, but a possibility, you're going to be generating more heat on the board and it's going to have trouble getting rid of that heat. Even though thermal throttling on SSDs isn't that common, generally just dumping a bunch of heat into a case like this is not a good idea because it heats everything up. So those would be the things to avoid for this case. Less temperature intensive things are fine. If you want visual and noise discretion, this is the place to look. As for competition that wasn't present in our tests, either because we don't have it or haven't gotten to it yet, we'd recommend looking into fractal design for alternatives in the noise space, and then we may start working on some of their cases in the near future. The Corsair Q series cases like the 400Q rather than the 400C would also be worth looking into, as they ditch the windowed side panel in favor of a noise damping side panel. And then Silverstone's got a couple offerings out there too, though not too many that are current. Even though his competitors will have difficulty coming close to what Be Quiet's done for noise, at $90, this is a reasonable buy. It's really one of the few products that we've reviewed in the past couple months that I can actually say the price seems fitting. That's pretty rare. Normally these things come out a bit high and then the manufacturers just step them down later. In this instance, or this case, it's really not bad. $90 is pretty okay. $100 for a tempered glass version, if you wanted it, I guess will exist. I don't know that I'd buy it. I'd have to see what the tint is like and things like that. But this case is really for being quiet. Tempered glass, you're not going to have a whole bunch of noise escaping, I would hope, depending on how they implement it. But it does just kind of seem like a weird combination. Sticking with this is a good one. Tempered glass, maybe not. So Be Quiet, overall, not the thickest steel, not the most robust plastics in the world for this case, but at $90, they are fair to use. If you're interested in learning more about the enclosure, you can read Patrick Lathan's full review, link in the description below. Hit the Patreon link in the post-roll video, or go to patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly. GamersNexus.net for the site. Thanks for watching. I'll see you all next time.